Well, good morning. It's sure good to see all of you and all of you who are joining us online. Great to have you with us. And so we, of course, are in this series about the minor prophets, and I'm going to be wrapping it up here today. And thank you, Joe. Joe's going to plug this in so that I can actually do my talk here this morning. Sometimes you think about the minor prophets, right? And people are like, oh, the minor prophets. That just seems like a bunch of grumpy guys from a long, long time ago, right? And the reason, one of the reasons I wanted to do this is because that's kind of a notion that I want to break a little bit. There are things that are done in a literary style way back then with the minor prophets, and there's things that they're speaking to that while may seem irrelevant, I want us to see how that part of the Bible is actually connected to the rest of the Bible, how that part of the Bible actually has something to say to you and me. It's just a desire to do this series to help make the Bible come alive in this. And so the other care, just like specific today, is with the book of Micah. And as we look at this book, you know, it is a book that has a number of different really cool themes to it. And it was actually hard for me to kind of land on one. There is this incredible theme in this book that deals with this idea of how God can take something bad and turn it into something good. I was like, that's a good sermon, right? There's another theme that runs through the book of Micah that is all about this idea that it has always been in God's heart to reach all people in the world, and all of this stuff that you see him building and doing to fashion relationship and community with the Jewish nation. This is his intent for the entire world. And think about that message coming out hundreds of years before Christ. And you see this come through, but we're not gonna deal with those, okay? Because I just don't have time. What I want to do this morning is I actually want us to hold something as a care that Micah holds as a care, and something that he holds really well. And something that he holds really well is the large story. Okay? This idea that there is this bigger story that is going on. And when we lose that story, it creates problems. But when we can hold on to it, it does something in our lives that is really, really good. And I want you to think about this, right? Because there is this larger story going on with your life, right? The story of your life has a bigger story to it. But so often, the chaos of life, chaos going in the world, all of the problems and things that we face can actually steal that bigger story away from us. And that's what I want to get into this, right? How many times have you turned on the news and all the craziness and chaos going on in the world, and you start thinking about it, and the next thing you know, like you feel uneasy about it, or you feel anxious about it, or it just dominates every conversation you have for the entire day. And it's like that bigger story of your life just like slips away in some moment. Or ever have like that struggle where it just like the mornings are this battle, right? Every morning I get up and there is this battle that you face with, maybe it's grief, or maybe it's addiction, or maybe it's anxiety or depression. And it's like that battle against those things like becomes the thing that so dominates that it's like it steals the bigger story of your life away. And that's the thing that Amos gets at in a way that I want us to look at this morning. Because here's the truth, right? There are passions and dreams that every one of you have. There are spiritual gifts that God has given you. There are things that God has put on your heart and your mind that matter to you, right? As a human being created in the image of God, I promise you, there are things that you have that God has put in there that matter to you. If I were to say to you, is it okay if you just exist through life? You'd be like, well, no, like there's something beyond existence that you long for, that you want your life to count. That's your story. There's a story that you want to be telling with your life. But right, we've all experienced this. Work or school or things that we've got to do, and we dig in and we get those things done, and then you run into this problem and this delay and that problem over there, and it feels like you don't have enough time to do this or resources or whatever. And it's like all of a sudden you look back and it's like I've got 20 plates spinning in the air, but I've lost the story of like what my life is about. And what I want to say is, if all you can see are the problems in your life, it's because the problems of your life have stolen the story. And when the problem steals your story, that becomes a much bigger problem. And that's something that we need to look at in all of this. Thank you. They very slightly told me that you couldn't see this. Change this real quick. But I'll come back to it. We'll use purple. There's a larger story, right? To your life in what's going on. Now you can read it, yeah. I have the best team in the world. Can I just say that? Yes. Danina, thank you very, very much. Yes. And by retro, in effect, then you have the best team in the world too, because they're your team and they're here serving you all the time. This issue of the story, it's so easy for us to lose that story. And when you think about it, it happens in the simplest of ways. If you're married, right, there was a time when you were in love and you thought, man, this is the person that I want to build a life around. And then life can go on and it's like you get into the routine of life and maybe there's little aggravations in that relationship, or you get into those routines and suddenly without realizing it, you can miss what were some of the deeper, more important reasons why you got married in the first place. And maybe it's not like your marriage is falling apart, but it's just kind of going along and it's lost its story, right? And that can happen with us in a number of different ways. And the thing that Micah would say is, don't lose your story. Don't let anything steal that story. And Micah is watching this happen in Israel and in Judah. Remember in the very first week, we looked at Amos, who spoke primarily to the southern kingdom. Last week, we looked at Habakkuk, who primarily spoke to the southern kingdom. And Micah is one that is going to speak really to both kingdoms, and his book would fall right in between those other two. And here's what's happening, just a little bit of background. Assyria is moving in. It's causing all of this disturbance, a lot of chaos, but they're still secure. But the leaders in Judah and Israel, and the leaders of the cities and the rulers over each of those kingdoms, they're actually taking advantage of this in a real sad way. They're beginning to take advantage of the people. They're seeing their fear and seeing how they can play on that fear. And it's starting to unwind things even worse and worse in this whole thing that is going on. And they're losing the story. And we all understand what it is to have these moments where something happens, right? Where the problem becomes this kind of thing where you just begin to lose the story. I remember there was a couple that Angie and I knew, wonderful family. They had 5 kids. And we got to know them fairly well. And then one night, like out of the blue, I get this call. And the wife of that family just up and left. And like when I was just like, wait a minute, no, not that family, not her, like that, this just doesn't, like it just didn't fit. But she just reached a point where she's just like, I can't do this. I can't keep doing this. And she had actually been planning this for a couple of months and managed to use her credit cards and some other credit. Anyhow, ended up being able to pull together probably like close to $200,000 in cash, which became debt for the rest of the family, for her husband, and left and moved to an island in the Caribbean. And you're just like, this feels like a bad intro to a movie, not something that really happened to someone we know in this moment. And all of a sudden, there is this dad with 5 kids and probably somewhere between like the ages of 6 to 16. okay? And all of a sudden, he's left in this moment. And once you get past like the moment of like, okay, I'm so mad at her and I don't understand like why she did this. All of a sudden, like when I sat down with the husband and started talking through it with him, and you just start realizing like, it's like, okay, what do I need to do to survive today? What do I need to do today to figure out, like, this is what I've got to do for my kids? He was a small business owner. Like, what have I got to do to keep my business going? And it was just like, I'm going to get today done. And then I can go on to the next day. And you know, I remember some of the early meetings that I had with him and just kind of pastoring him through all of that. And man, does my hat go off to him at how he was able to just say, I'm gonna rally in this thing, and I'm gonna focus on what needs to be done today, and I'm gonna get that done. And I'm not going to let this problem bury me or overwhelm me. I'm not gonna let that happen. But I realized as that went on, after a few weeks and a few months, he was doing a stellar job, right? Of saying, I'm gonna get whatever I have to get done today, I'm gonna get it done today. I'm gonna figure this out. But I started to see in him this struggle. And it's this, when you're in survival mode, like I'm gonna just get this done today, that's a great strategy for surviving. But when day after day adds up to just day after day, he was losing the larger story of just what his life was all about. That he still had this beautiful family and these kids, and he loved them deeply. But the bigger picture of that was kind of getting lost in all of this. Ever have a moment in your life where you look and you go, man, I am so devoted, and it's everything I can do to just get through today, and I'm just doing this thing. And you realize I'm stacking this up in a way, and maybe I'm losing the bigger picture, the bigger story of my life. Ever experienced that? So Micah would be one to say, you can't live in that forever, because it will eventually become a kind of downward spiral. It will become a kind of fog. I just remember talking with that dad, and there'd be moments where we'd have coffee, especially early on, and it was just like he was in a fog. And like, no kidding, he was in a fog in all of this. But what I realized is like, but that doesn't mean that he didn't need to somehow find a way to capture that bigger picture in all of this. And this is the thing that Amos, I'm stuck on Amos, that Micah is going to get at. And here's what I want to do. I'm going to walk you through the book of Micah here in a very abridged way. So what Micah does is, and he's probably an older prophet, he has actually served under multiple kings of both Judah and Israel. And it's like he sees this bigger problem, right? He sees this problem where the kings are definitely like caught in these sins that are hurting the people, but he sees this bigger issue of what he needs to call them back to. So the book of Micah is really made up of 3 cycles. There's these, you could break it down into 3 parts, and each of them is somewhat of this repeating cycle. So I wanna walk you through this, and you could call this the cycles of warning and hope. And if you have the card, there's a section on there that talks about the warning and hope, and if you want, you can kind of diagram this out as well. And this would be a way to diagram the book of Micah. So let's start with the warnings. Let's actually start with, that'd be too much purple for me. All right, let's start with the warnings. And what I want to do is I want to look at all 3 cycles and just go through the warnings on all 3 cycles, and then come back and we'll go through all 3 cycles on the hope. So on these, he starts off in the first cycle, and each of these cycles starts off with this idea of you hear this. In fact, he even uses these words, hear this. There is something that you're missing that you need to hear, that you understand. And he starts it off speaking to a particular audience. And the first audience that he speaks to are the prophets. And so he's gonna say to the prophets, like, you need to hear this, you need to understand this. And here's his warning. Like, you have become selfish, you have become inwardly focused, and so much so that now, with all the chaos going on, you, in a selfish way, you think you can just take advantage of it. And they were doing things like this. They were selling blessings, right? So it's like, okay, I know you're scared about what's gonna happen. I tell you what, I'll sell you a promise that God will take care of you. I'll sell you a blessing. And they're using their religious position to extract extra money from people and people that didn't have it. And Micah's like, this is a sin. This is not okay to be doing this. So now we get into the second cycle here. And this cycle, again, begins with this thing of like, you need to hear this. There's something that you're missing in all of this. And this time, he's speaking to the prophets and the rulers. I don't have enough space to write prophets and rulers, but he adds the rulers to the prophets in this one. And again, starts with like, you need to hear this. And his issue with them is you have seen this as your opportunity. And a great way to put this is to bully people. Like you are literally hurting people. He talks about how they were actually pushing people out of their own homes because part of what they were doing is like, okay, if the Assyrians are gonna come and we've gotta, go on the run or get kicked out of here, we're gonna amass some wealth and we'll be able to flee and be safe, and we'll leave all these other people that we're responsible for leading, we'll leave them here to suffer under the Assyrians. And Micah's like that, this is wrong, this is not okay. And when you think about bullies, remember the thing about bullies is they do not bully from a place of internal strength. They don't say, well, I'm gonna bully and pick on these people because I feel powerful and strong, right? It's actually the opposite that happens. It is out of their sense of weakness and fear that they bully others in an effort to try and feel strong. And that's what he's saying to them. And he's saying, and what you do when you do this is terrible for these people. Let me just read you one portion out of Micah in this second cycle. This is in Micah chapter 3 at the beginning. He says this, "Then I said, listen, you leaders of Jacob, you rulers of Israel, should you not embrace justice? You who hate good and love evil, who tear the skin from my people and the flesh from their bones," right? And it's just this graphic moment of just saying what you're doing to it is as if you're just pulling, the life off of them, their flesh, and they're just like, this is terrible, right? So he goes through these warnings and he's calling us out and he's saying, God's gonna judge you for this. God will bring justice to this. God will correct this. Now, he gets to the third cycle in this whole thing. And again, it's this idea that there's something you're missing, something that you need to see. But he does something interesting in this one. He is speaking very much to the prophets and the rulers, but he ends up including everyone in this, which sounds a little strange, right? Because you think, like, why are you getting on everyone's case? A lot of these people are like the victims of the rulers and the prophets and all of the things that they're doing in all of this. But it's interesting what he says about this, because his issue with them is, in this moment where you are struggling so much, you're not trusting me. You're turning to other gods. You're turning to yourselves. You're like, why don't you trust me? He says this in chapter 6 during this third cycle. He says this. It says, "My people, what have I done to you? How have I burned you? Answer me." And it's this thing where he's just saying, like, why you treat me like almost like I'm one of these groups. You're not trusting me. And the way this works is you've got to trust me. I want to be your God and you my people in this whole thing, and you're not trusting me in this whole thing. And what you see is this cycle where he says, I'm warning you, the way you're living this out doesn't work, and I will bring justice in this, right? So this is the warnings section in all of this. So then, with each of these cycles comes this hope section in this. So let's look at this hope section for just a minute, all right? So it's interesting what he does with the hope part of this. So he comes along and he's like, okay, there's something now that you need to respond to or understand. And what he draws them to is a story. he does this in each of the cycles, and it's a story about a particular character. He brings in these different characters. So in the first cycle, he brings in Jacob. And if you know anything about the story of Jacob, and if you don't, that's fine as well. But Jacob is this character that from their past that is very important. But you know, Jacob is one that he just seemed like he couldn't hardly make a good decision to save his life, right? He just messes it up constantly. And there's this thing that keeps coming out again and again in Jacob's life that oftentimes motivates him. He's a guy that ends up going on the run oftentimes, and it is fear. Whether it's fear from his brother or fear from others. And he just gets off track again and again and again. And you would think that this character and the way he constantly responds to fear and makes these terrible decisions, that it's just like his story is a bust. Nothing good could come out of it. But he's in the line of like, Jacob will be named by God Israel. And the 12 tribes of Israel are gonna come out of his 12 sons in this thing. And what you see, everyone that would be hearing Micah talk about this, they would understand when he's talking about Jacob, it's not just the fear, this is also a story of amazing grace, right? And grace is favor. God's favor was with Jacob constantly, even when he made terrible decisions, because God's grace, God's favor is unconditional. And it followed Jacob all along. And he's saying, listen, what, do you remember the story? You're a part of this story. And even when you feel fear, like respond to God out of his grace, his favor, and it will change the trajectory of your life. So then he comes along in the second cycle. And again, there's this thing that he wants to point them toward in all of this. And this time, he puts in the story of David and kind of does it in a clever way, but he brings in the story of David. And the story of David, the thing you need to know most about David is he comes from one of the smallest clans of one of the smallest tribes, and he is the smallest of all of his brothers. There's 8 brothers in his family. He's the smallest, right? And if anyone would ever think, if there's someone who's going to become the king of Israel, it wouldn't be the smallest, youngest brother of one of the smallest clans in one of the smallest tribes. And there's just kind of this thing of it's small or weak. And yet, here's the story of David. He becomes the greatest king, the greatest leader that Israel ever saw in this thing. I want to show you this one spot just real quickly where Micah references David in this very clever, poetic way. This is in chapter 5, verse 5. Because, you know, the Assyrians, they feel threatened by the Assyrians, and they feel weak in light of how powerful the Assyrians are. And Micah writes this, and he will be our peace. When the Assyrians invade our land and march through our fortresses, we will rise against them. Here it is. This is a reference to David. 7 shepherds, even 8 commanders. And the whole idea there, it's just this poetic way. David had 7 brothers that were shepherds. And with David, they become 8. And it's just like, they're our commanders. And it's just, all Micah is doing in this way is he's saying, listen, do you remember the story of David? The guy who fought Goliath, right? He may be small, he may have seemed weak, but this is a story of incredible courage. And do you see what he's doing in this? He's saying, I see your sin and I see what you're doing to people, but your story is Jacob's story, and it's a story of grace. Your story, I know you may feel small looking at the Assyrians bearing down on us, but your story is one of incredible courage. And then he gets over to the last cycle here. And he actually asks them to remember a number of different stories and characters throughout the Bible. But at the very end, he comes and he lands at a very particular character, and that is Abraham. And of course, Abraham's story is one where God says, you know, I'm gonna make your descendants as numerous as the stars, and I'm gonna do great things through your line and your heritage. And then he and his wife Sarah can't get pregnant. And they try and try and try, and then they get in their 80s and their 90s. And at one level, it seems hopeless. Abraham and Sarah struggle with a feeling of hopelessness. Ever struggle with a sense of hopelessness? Sure. It's just like the problems are mounting up. I'll never be able to overcome that. And yet, what Micah is saying is, when you feel that though, remember your story is also Abraham's story. And it is a story of amazing faith. Because faith is what Abraham is known for in this. So do you see what's happening here? What Micah is doing in each of these cycles is he's saying, I need you to see the bigger story that you're a part of. Because if you can see the bigger story, you can understand that God is doing, there's something to draw on that bigger story, that you can live out of God's grace, God's courage, and God's faith in all of this. This, okay, is a way oversimplification, but this captures the basic nature of the minor prophet Micah and what he writes. It is about not forgetting the bigger story that you're connected to. So I say all of this, and what I want to kind of draw us to a conclusion here in all of this is, right, all of us want to feel that larger story, right? If you're here this morning and you've lost that sense of purpose in your life, and you just feel like, man, every day is just a day of existence, I promise you, as a human being made in the image of God, that will suck the lifeblood out of your soul, won't it? And if you're in that place right now, you know what I'm talking about, right? All of us, we have a bigger picture of dreams and hopes of where we want to see our relationships go, how we want our life to count. There is a story that we all want our lives to tell. But we also live in a world filled with chaos and fear and weakness and hopelessness. And when that loads us down, what happens? We lose our story. And what Micah would say is, you've got to get back a hold of the larger story that God has for you. I think about that dad and just watching him go through just what is unimaginable. It was hard to comprehend. But in spending time with him and talking with him, and again, watching him just say, I'm gonna stick in there and I'm gonna keep on going. I'm gonna keep moving forward in all of these things. Remember having coffee with him one time, and this was several months, maybe even longer into this whole thing, and kind of had everything situated out, and we were having coffee, and it's just kind of like, he was just in that place where it's just like, I'm tired, to the middle of my being in this whole thing. And man, he was doing it. I just admire him in so many ways for how he walked through all of that with great grace. But it was wearing him out. And there's a moment where I just asked him about one of his kids. And he started talking about one of his kids, one of his girls that was in sports and how she was doing really good. And he laughed. And it was almost like his head started to come up. And then I asked him, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna ask him about his other kids. I just started asking about his kids. How are they doing? What are they up to? And he started going through what his kids were doing and where they were at. And his oldest daughter was driving at that point, and he's like, it's a good thing, because I need the help driving all over the place. And she hasn't hit anything yet. But I taught her how to drive a tractor, which kind of worried me a little bit because, he's going back and forth on this thing. And he just started laughing a little bit. In fact, at one point he laughed and he said, Glenn, when this whole thing started, you told me to go get counseling. And I was like, no, I'm a tough guy. I don't need to get counseling. But I've decided maybe I need to get some counseling in this whole thing. We laughed about this thing. And as he started thinking about his kids, all of a sudden he started finding that story. There's something I want for those kids. And he started seeing that, right, his life is more than just getting through the next day. His life is about, how do I get my kids anchored into a way where they can live their story? And I tell you, in that moment, it was like energy started kind of just flowing inside of him is that as he started talking about his kids and the role he knew he would have in anchoring them in, he went on and helped, for most of his kids, he helped them start their own business. And this is like following the story like years later. A few of them went on to college and they're like, no, Dad, I don't need you to start my own business. I've got my own career picked out. But he was a small business person, and he set any of his kids up that wanted a business to have a business. And I was just like, wow. And getting a hold of that larger story just started to fill him with energy in a story that I look at and I'm just like, I don't know how you made it through in that. But it's because he held that larger story. So let me just share a little bit here, and a little bit out of Micah as well, about holding on to that larger story, okay? First thing is this. You've got to remember, remind yourself God is shepherding a larger story, okay? In each of these cycles, Micah does this little thing that I absolutely love. In each of these cycles, there is a moment where God is pictured as a shepherd, right? In a Minor Prophet, where he's talking about God's judgment for the things they're doing wrong and all of these, crazy things God is going to do, there's always a moment where he describes God as a shepherd, as in a way that it's like God was shepherding this story in Jacob's life, and God was shepherding a story in David's life, and God was shepherding a story in Abraham's life. And here's the lesson, friends. God is shepherding a story in your life. Right? I don't think we have this passage on a slide, but let me just read this to you if I can find it. Here it is. This is out of Micah chapter 5. I want you to just listen to this. He will stand and shepherd his flock, and in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they will live securely, for then his greatness will reach to the ends of the earth. And this is just one of those little examples where he's just like, God is like this shepherd, and there's not gonna be anything that's gonna stop him. He can shepherd the story in your life as well. And the beauty of this is like, we need this, right? Because sometimes we're like sheep, right? Have you ever noticed like sheep, sometimes they can wander off or around someplace and then end up not even knowing how they got there, right? And I just think that's us as human beings. Sometimes we go through and we chase choices, and sometimes it's bad choices, benign choices, but sometimes we can just lose the larger story. There was just for fun, there was this a YouTube video that I saw of this guy had some sheep, and apparently there was something, he would open up the gate to let the sheep out, and he had one sheep that every time he'd go out the gate, it would take this just hard right turn, but he had this half of a 55-gallon drum buried in the dirt, and this sheep would jump into the drum and then get trapped, and he'd have to pull this sheep out. And he was trying to train the sheep not to do this, and finally the sheep wouldn't learn it. So finally he's just like, maybe I'll get famous on YouTube by filming this sheep. So like 3 times in a row, he opens up the gate and this sheep bolts out and right into the thing. And then he goes over and he pulls it out and he pulls, go this way, whatever, and pulls the sheep back, closes the gate. And this is like 5 seconds later. And the sheep is like right back in the same spot. And I just thought, I wonder if we do that with God sometimes. I wonder if God's like, no, let me do 3 cycles to try and teach you this truth. And it's just like, and we kind of keep going back to the same thing. But here's the thing, right? You have to remember, even in those moments where I feel like I'm in that fog, God is my shepherd, and he's shepherding my story to someplace beautiful, someplace that he has in mind for me. Second thing, you have to choose to live out of that larger story. And this becomes the harder part in this. It starts with identifying that story. So let me just ask you here for just a moment. I want you to think about this in your own life. What are some of your deepest longings? What are some of your spiritual gifts? What are some of the things that you look at in life and you say, I've got passion about this. Something needs to be done about that, right? What do you dream of for your kids or your friends, right? See, somewhere in all of that is your story. It's wrapped up in your gifts and your passions, what God has been doing in your life. And when you face a problem, right? There's this tension that you're gonna have to hold. And this is the tension, because the thing that wants to steal our story is, right, those things that are overwhelming, those difficulties or those problems. And here's the tension with those problems. One, in one hand, don't minimize what you face with the problem. So what I don't want you to take away from today is, oh, Glenn wants me to go and pretend like my problems aren't very bad problems. That's not what I'm saying in this, okay? You can't minimize them, because if you minimize those problems, in the end, there are lessons that you will not learn out of those problems. There will be moments out of those things that you don't minimize it, right? Because there is pain, there is hurt, there's fears that are real. You have to be realistic with it. But you can't let it come to dominate. And so here's the other tension that you have to hold with it, and that is, don't over magnify the problems that you face, right? Because there are times where there can be that problem, and you can make that problem everything you eat, breathe, and drink. You're gonna have to pick moments, right, where you're going to push those problems aside and say, I need to remind myself of what is the thing that'll lift my head in this moment, in all of this. This will take steps of courage. I think one of the reasons why Micah brings in, touches on the story of David is because David, again, a man with lots of flaws and lots of problems, but one of the things David was known for was a man after God's own heart. And he lived with this kind of bold courage. Here's courage. Let me give you a definition of courage, because I'm gonna ask you to live in this, okay? To hold that bigger story is gonna take courage. Here's courage. Courage is the strength we derive from knowing what matters more than what you're afraid of. There will be things that you're afraid of that will cause you to hold back, right? And that's not a bad thing, unless it holds you back from what matters more. And so ask yourself, am I holding back in this moment because of a fear? And I promise you, as you begin to identify what matters to you more than what you're afraid of, you're getting in touch with the larger story that God is shepherding in your life. And you will derive strength from knowing that. So remember, your story is connected to a story of God's that is one of great courage. And lastly, let me just close with this thought real quickly, because I would imagine there's a few of you here this morning and you're going, Glenn, I can't even get to my story. I can't even, like, if you knew what was happening in my life, the pain or the hurt or the worry or the anxiety, I just can't get there. So if that's where you are, this third point's really for you, and it's this. Remember, even when you lose your story, God hasn't lost your story. I promise you, God has not lost your story. You know why? Because the truth is, your story isn't your story to begin with. It's God's story. It's God's story that he is shepherding into your life to become your story. So if there's ever a moment where hopelessness is just overwhelming, and you say, I can't even find my story, I want you to be at peace and go, okay, I can't find it in this moment, but even in my hopelessness, I will have the faith to know that God is still holding that story, and he will shepherd it back to me. At some point, I'm gonna get that story, because God's not going to let it disappear. That's the beauty of this. And so Micah, he's not just saying, stop doing all this terrible stuff. He is saying that, and he's saying, God's gonna correct that, and it's not okay. But the way he's pulling people forward is to say, if you could see your bigger story, if you could see that your story is a part of God's story, it would give you grace. It would give you courage. It would give you faith that would pull you forward in a way that would allow you to live even in difficult times as what you're going through. So friends, be like Micah. Don't lose the big story of what God is shepherding through your life.